The whole town laughed at his house and said winter would finish him. A retired veteran, nearly broke, moved to the edge of a frozen Midwestern city with nothing but an old pickup, a red and black flannel jacket, and his loyal German shepherd. He built a strange A-frame cabin everyone called a shed. But when the cold dropped to deadly levels and his dog refused to leave the warm stone floor hours after the fire went out, the truth began to surface. What they discovered inside that mocked little cabin would force an entire town to rethink everything they thought they knew about survival and change the old veteran's fate forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter came early to Duluth, Minnesota, dragging wind off Lake Superior like a living thing with teeth. Walter Collins stood on a narrow strip of frozen ground just east of the old ore docks, the sky a hard gray ceiling pressing down on the city. He was 68 years old, tall but slightly bent at the shoulders, as if his spine still remembered the weight of a pack that was no longer there. His face was long and angular, cut with deep lines that no smile had ever fully erased. A short, iron-gray beard framed his jaw, trimmed not for vanity but habit, the kind learned in places where disorder got men killed. His eyes were pale blue, steady and watchful, the eyes of someone who had learned to measure danger without panic. He wore the same thing he wore almost every day: heavy work boots scarred by years of use, faded denim jeans, and a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the wool worn thin at the elbows but still stubbornly warm. Beside him sat Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest, dark saddle markings, and intelligent amber eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon. Rex's muzzle was just beginning to gray, but his posture remained alert, disciplined, as if he too understood the language of vigilance. The dog had come from a military working dog program years earlier, retired young after a leg injury that never fully healed but never slowed him much. Walter trusted Rex more than he trusted people, and Rex returned that trust with quiet, unquestioning loyalty. Walter had not come to Duluth chasing romance or reinvention. He came because it was cold, remote, and cheap, and because cold had never frightened him. What frightened him was dependence. After the war, after the noise, the orders, the sudden losses, civilian life had felt strangely loud in all the wrong ways. Crowded rooms made his skin crawl. Sudden laughter could put his heart into a sprint. Over the years, people learned to call him distant, even unfriendly. But the truth was simpler. Walter conserved himself. He spoke little, listened much, and avoided promises he might not be able to keep. When a factory accident took 2 fingers from his left hand and ended his last steady job, he sold what little he had left and bought this narrow plot of land near the lake, a place most people considered unsuitable for anything permanent. The realtor had raised an eyebrow when Walter paid in cash and said he planned to build before winter. "You're late in the season," she'd warned gently. Walter had nodded. He already knew. He also knew he had no money for contractors, no time to wait, and no patience for designs that required excess. He had timber scavenged from a closed mill, stone pulled by hand from a frozen creek bed, and the skills of a man who had learned to make do when making do was the only option. The decision to build an A-frame came not from theory or trend, but memory. As a young man, long before the war, Walter had worked summer jobs in logging camps where equipment sheds were thrown together fast, steep-roofed structures that shed snow and survived storms better than the men who built them. He remembered how those shapes defied collapse, how the weight of winter slid off them instead of pressing down. Standing on that frozen ground, with Rex's breath steaming beside him, the shape felt right. Not comfortable. Right. By mid-October, the first comments arrived with the frost. Tom Hargreaves was the first neighbor to stop his truck and stare. Tom was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a red face and a laugh that came easily, a former dock worker who believed firmly in square walls and bigger stoves. He leaned out his window, took in the sloping frame, and shook his head. "You building a house or a dog tent?" he called out, not unkindly. Walter wiped sawdust from his hands and glanced at Rex, who sat calmly at the edge of the clearing. "Both," Walter replied, then returned to his work. Tom laughed and drove on, already certain he'd just witnessed a mistake. Others were less charitable. Sarah Whitcomb, who ran a small bakery 3 blocks inland, passed the site on her morning walks. She was a woman in her early 40s, tall and slender, with dark brown hair usually pulled into a loose braid and skin pale from years spent waking before dawn. Her face carried a permanent look of concern, as if she were always calculating the thin margin between comfort and hardship. She paused one morning, watching Walter stack stone around a shallow foundation. "That won't hold heat," she said, her voice practical rather than cruel. "Stone pulls the cold right up into your bones." Walter nodded politely. Sarah meant well. She always did. Still, she walked away shaking her head, convinced she was watching a slow disaster assemble itself. The frame went up quickly. 2 steep planes of timber rose from the stone base and met at a sharp ridge, forming a narrow triangle that looked almost defensive in its posture. There were no vertical walls, no loft, no wasted corners. Inside, the space felt compressed, intimate, like the interior of a tent or a ship's cabin. Walter laid the stone floor carefully, setting each piece into a bed of sand and clay, his hands aching in the cold. He built a small iron stove at the center, not large enough to impress anyone, and ran the chimney straight up through the ridge. Around the stove he stacked more stone, heavy river rock layered thick and wide, because stone was free and wood was not. He told himself it was for durability, for not having to replace a wooden floor every few years. He did not tell himself it was for warmth. He was not thinking in those terms yet. As November closed in, the laughter grew sharper. A few men at the local hardware store referred to the structure as Collins's Folly. Someone pinned a hand-drawn cartoon of a triangle with icicles to the bulletin board. Walter saw it and removed it without comment. Mockery, he had learned, was often just fear wearing a grin. Inside, though, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old doubt creeping in during quiet moments. At night, lying on a borrowed cot with Rex curled near his boots, he wondered if they were right. He wondered if pride had disguised itself as practicality. He wondered, briefly, what it would feel like to fail again. The first real cold snap answered nothing. Temperatures dipped below 0, and Walter lit his stove cautiously, feeding it sparingly. The stone beneath his feet warmed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Rex shifted closer to the stove, then stretched out, content. Walter slept lightly, waking often out of habit, expecting to feel the bite of cold in the air. It never came. By morning, the fire had burned down to embers, yet the cabin remained tolerable, even comfortable. Walter sat on the edge of the cot, boots resting on warm stone, and felt something unfamiliar loosen inside his chest. Not triumph. Relief. He said nothing to anyone. He continued working, continued burning little wood, continued letting the town believe what it wanted. When winter truly arrived, when the lake wind sharpened and the snow began to fall sideways, the A-frame stood quietly against it all, Rex at the door, Walter inside, both waiting. The decision they mocked had already been made. The consequences, good or bad, were coming. The wind off Lake Superior grew sharper by the day, slicing through Duluth with a persistence that felt almost personal, as if the lake itself resented anyone who tried to stand still near its shores. Walter Collins noticed the change not by the cold alone, but by sound. The deeper moan of wind sliding down the steep plains of his A-frame, the way it rushed past instead of battering the walls. Inside the cabin, the air felt different from the outside world. Heavier somehow, calmer, as if the structure had decided to hold its breath against the storm. Walter moved slowly as he worked, his boots scraping softly across the stone floor that now filled the interior from edge to edge. Each stone had been set by hand, his fingers stiff and aching, the memory of missing fingers on his left hand flaring whenever the cold pressed too hard. Rex followed him in silence, nails clicking lightly on stone, the shepherd's dark coat glossy against the gray interior, his ears twitching at every new sound. The dog was 7, old enough to be steady, young enough to still carry the discipline of his working years. When Rex chose a spot near the door and lay down, Walter took it as a sign the space was finally becoming something like safe territory. By early November, the house had become a quiet spectacle. People slowed their cars as they passed. Some stared openly, others pretended not to look. The structure unsettled them, not because it was ugly, but because it defied expectation. There were no square walls to anchor the eye, no comforting symmetry of logs stacked the way they had been for generations. Instead, the cabin leaned inward, steep and compact, like a creature hunkering down against attack. Walter noticed how often people avoided stepping too close, as if the angles themselves might judge them. He didn't mind. Attention, even negative, was better than interference. One afternoon, Sarah Whitcomb appeared again, bundled in a long wool coat the color of wet ash, her dark hair tucked under a knit hat that did little to soften her sharp cheekbones. She carried a small paper bag from her bakery, steam faintly fogging the air as she approached. Sarah was careful by nature, shaped that way by years of running a business that balanced on thin margins and early mornings. She had learned to read signs of trouble long before trouble announced itself. She paused just inside the cleared area, eyes scanning the stone floor, the central stove, the narrowness of the space. "It's smaller than I thought," she said, her voice measured. Walter nodded, adjusting a stone near the stove. "Smaller means less to heat," he replied. Sarah frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in calculation. "And the stone?" she asked. "Stone holds," Walter said simply. She studied him for a moment, taking in the way his shoulders never quite relaxed, the way his eyes tracked the door even while he spoke. Something about him suggested a man who had learned not to explain himself, because explanations rarely saved anything. Sarah left the bag on a crate near the door. "Bread," she said. "You'll need the calories." Walter thanked her, surprised by the small kindness. After she left, Rex sniffed the bag and wagged his tail once, a brief restrained gesture of approval. The nickname came a week later. Walter heard it first at the hardware store when he went to buy stovepipe sealant. A pair of men stood near the counter, both thick-jacketed and red-faced from the cold. One of them, a man named Earl Jensen Short, barrel-chested, with a thick blonde mustache stiffened by frost, snorted as Walter passed. "That's him," Earl muttered, not quietly. "Guy with the luxury doghouse." The other man laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. Walter paid, nodded to the clerk, and left without reacting. Outside, Rex waited patiently by the truck, tail low, eyes alert. Walter rested a hand on the dog's head for a moment, grounding himself. He had heard worse names in worse places. What unsettled him was not the insult, but the certainty behind it. These men believed what they said. Belief, he knew, could be dangerous. The first real storm hit in mid-November. Snow came sideways, driven by a wind that howled through the trees and rattled loose signs along the road. Walter sealed the door carefully, checking the fit, pressing clay into a seam he hadn't liked the look of earlier. The stove burned low, fed by short, deliberate pieces of wood. The stone around it darkened slightly as it absorbed heat, radiating a quiet warmth that crept outward across the floor. Rex paced once, then settled near the center, stretching his legs toward the stove, sighing softly in contentment. Walter sat on a rough bench and listened. No drafts, no sudden cold fingers reaching through the walls. The roof did not creak the way log cabins did under snow load. The weight slid down and away. For the first time since arriving in Duluth, Walter slept deeply. By morning, the storm had buried the road, and the town felt distant, muffled. Walter opened the door to clear snow and was met with a blast of white and gray. Across the way, he spotted Tom Hargreaves trudging toward him, scarf pulled up over his mouth, eyes squinting against the glare. Tom stopped a few feet away, stamping his boots. "Didn't think you'd make it through that one," he said, half joking, half expecting to be right. Walter stepped aside and opened the door wider. Warm air spilled out, visible in the sudden fog of Tom's breath. Tom froze, confusion flickering across his weathered face. "You burning all night?" he asked. "No," Walter said. "Low fire. Stone stays warm." Tom didn't step inside. He just stared, then laughed uncertainly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, backing away as if the warmth itself challenged something he'd always known. Word traveled faster after that, carried by glances and half-finished sentences. Some people insisted Walter was exaggerating. Others decided he was simply stubborn enough to suffer in silence. Earl Jensen told anyone who would listen that stone floors were thieves, stealing heat from the body. At night, when the wind rose again and stoves across Duluth roared, Walter sat quietly with Rex, feeding the fire once before bed, then letting it die down. The cabin cooled slowly, reluctantly, the stone releasing its stored warmth like a held breath finally let go. Walter lay awake, aware of every sound, every sensation, waiting for the moment when cold would claim its due. It never did. There were moments, though, when doubt returned not about the house but about himself. On the worst nights, memories crept in uninvited, the weight of silence after explosions, the way responsibility settled heavy and permanent. He would reach down and rest a hand on Rex's flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. Rex, who had once been trained to detect danger, now detected only Walter's unrest and responded the same way every time by staying. That, Walter thought, might be the most reliable form of heat there was. By the end of the month, the A-frame was no longer just strange. It was unsettling. It challenged the unspoken rules Duluth lived by. People didn't like that. But winter was tightening its grip, and the wind off Lake Superior was only getting stronger. Walter knew the real test had not yet arrived. The house stood ready, quiet and unassuming, while the town prepared for a fight it believed it already understood. January arrived without ceremony, the kind of arrival that did not knock but broke the door down, dragging temperatures to -30°C and turning the wind off Lake Superior into something sharp enough to feel intentional. Duluth changed its rhythm overnight. Streets emptied faster. Conversations shortened. Smoke thickened above rooftops like a signal flare of collective anxiety. Fires burned constantly in the traditional cabins. Big stoves fed before dawn, fed again at midday, fed until midnight, and then fed once more before sleep. Men woke with cracked lips and burning eyes. Their first instinct each morning to check whether the embers had survived the night. Woodpiles shrank at an alarming rate, cords disappearing in days instead of weeks, and the sound of axes rang out endlessly, a hard metallic rhythm echoing through frozen neighborhoods. Winter was no longer a season. It was a siege. Walter Collins noticed the shift the same way he noticed most things, not through noise but through absence. From his A-frame near the lake, the town sounded farther away now, muffled by snow and fear. Inside his cabin, the air remained steady, calm, almost stubbornly neutral, refusing to mirror the violence outside. He fed the stove in the early evening with 3 short logs, sometimes 4 if the wind screamed particularly hard, then sat back on his bench and watched the flames settle into a low, disciplined burn. The stone beneath his boots held warmth like a memory it refused to let go of. Rex lay stretched out on the floor, his dark body relaxed, paws extended, ears flicking only when the wind hit the roof at a new angle. The dog's behavior told Walter more than any thermometer could. Rex did not curl tight. Rex did not shiver. He slept the deep, unguarded sleep of an animal that felt no threat. Outside, belief began to fracture. People started counting things logs per day, hours between feedings, degrees gained and lost, and Walter's numbers did not fit. Tom Hargreaves was the first to voice it aloud. Tom, who had always been loud and broad and sure of himself, now looked worn around the edges, his beard rimmed with frost whenever he spoke too long outdoors. He stopped Walter one morning as Walter hauled a small stack of split wood from his truck. "How much you burning?" Tom asked, trying to sound casual. Walter shrugged. "4 yesterday." Tom blinked. He laughed, but it came out wrong. "4? I burned 12 just to keep the pipes from freezing." Walter said nothing. Tom glanced at Rex, who stared back calmly, then shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. The doubt followed him like a shadow. Others were less subtle. Earl Jensen grew louder as the cold deepened. Earl's face was perpetually flushed now, his thick mustache stiff with ice whenever he stepped outside. He stood near the trading post one afternoon, voice carrying across the frozen air. "Stone floors steal heat," he insisted. "Everyone knows that. You put your feet on stone, you're bleeding warmth straight into the ground." A few men nodded, grateful for the certainty. But the words rang hollow when Earl went home and fed his stove again 2 hours later. Belief was one thing. Experience was another. Sarah Whitcomb came by one evening just before dusk. Her bakery closed early because flour shipments had stopped, and the ovens couldn't compete with the cold. She looked thinner than she had in autumn, her dark hair escaping its braid, skin pale against the wool of her coat. She carried herself with the careful precision of someone conserving energy. When Walter opened the door, the warmth brushed her face and she stopped mid-step. "It's warm," she said quietly. not as a question. Walter nodded. She stepped inside, eyes moving across the stone floor, the central stove, the steep planes of the walls. I burned through half my wood already, she admitted after a moment. And it's only January. There was no pride left in her voice, only calculation and a flicker of fear. Walter poured her a cup of hot water, dropped in a pinch of dried herbs he'd been saving, and handed it to her without comment. She wrapped her hands around the cup and sighed, shoulders sagging. People are starting to talk, she said. Not like before. The real test came during the third week of January, when a high-pressure system settled over the region and refused to move. The cold stopped fluctuating and became constant, unrelenting. Night after night, temperatures stayed below -30. The wind followed, driving itself into every crack and seam it could find. Houses that had always felt solid suddenly felt porous. Drafts appeared where none had existed before. Families began rationing heat, letting fires die low at night, and waking to ice forming on the inside of windows. Some burned furniture. Others tore down old fencing. The trading post ran low on kerosene, and tempers shortened alongside supplies. Walter noticed the change in behavior more than the change in weather. Fewer cars passed his place now. When they did, they slowed. One night, long after dark, headlights swept across the snow outside his door and stopped. Rex lifted his head, ears forward, but did not growl. Walter opened the door to find Jack Miller standing there, shoulders hunched, breath ragged from the cold. Jack was a man in his early 60s, lean to the point of sharpness, with a deeply lined face and eyes that had seen too many winters without complaint. He had always been polite, distant, the kind of man shaped by loss he never spoke about. "I don't mean to intrude," Jack said, voice tight. "But are you managing?" Walter stepped aside. Jack hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold. The warmth hit him hard. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked almost angry, as if the cabin had betrayed him personally. "How?" he asked. Walter pointed at the stone, the stove, the shape of the room. Jack exhaled slowly, a long, shaking breath. "My fire went out last night," he admitted. "I didn't hear it. Woke up to ice in the sink." He stayed only a few minutes, long enough to feel the truth settle into his bones, then left without another word. The next day, people noticed Jack's woodpile shrink less quickly. Inside the A-frame, life continued at a quieter pace. Walter's nights were still restless, but now the memories came less often, softened by the physical certainty of warmth. He understood, dimly, that something beyond luck was at work. The stone floor released heat long after the fire died, the compact space holding it close, refusing to waste it. Rising warmth met the steep walls and returned downward, spreading evenly instead of escaping into useless height. Walter did not name these principles. He only felt their effects. He had survived worse conditions with less, but never with this kind of steady comfort. By the end of January, the whispers had changed tone. No one laughed anymore. People argued instead. Some claimed Walter was exaggerating. Others claimed he must be burning secretly at night. A few suggested the dog was generating heat of his own. Walter ignored it all. He split wood in daylight, fed the stove sparingly, and slept while others woke every few hours to tend roaring fires. Rex remained his constant shadow, calm, observant, the living proof that the space was not lying. Winter had finally shown its true face to Duluth, and it was unforgiving. But beneath the wind off Lake Superior, one strange triangular house stood quiet and warm, its smoke thin, its presence unsettling. Walter knew the questions would come soon. He also knew the answers would not belong to words alone. The night Jack Miller finally came knocking was the kind of night that stripped away pride and left only necessity. A night when the wind off Lake Superior no longer sounded like weather, but like intent, hammering itself into Duluth with a persistence that wore men down faster than hunger. Jack had resisted longer than most. Stubborn by nature and sharpened by decades of surviving without complaint, he was a man whose lean frame and deeply etched features told a quiet story of endurance. His hair, once dark, had thinned to a steel gray that clung close to his scalp, and his beard uneven, rough grew not from neglect, but from habit. Loss had shaped him years earlier, the kind of loss that rearranged a man's priorities without ever fully explaining itself, leaving him cautious with words and slow to ask for help. But that night, after his stove had burned itself to ash and the water in his sink froze solid, Jack wrapped his scarf tight, pulled on his boots, and followed the half-buried path toward Walter Collins's strange triangular house. He told himself he was only checking. He told himself many things. The wind did not care. Walter heard the knock before Rex reacted, a dull, hesitant sound that barely cut through the howl outside. When he opened the door, the effect was immediate and undeniable. Warm air spilled outward like something alive, rolling across Jack's boots, fogging his breath, pushing back against the cold with quiet authority. Walter stood there in the doorway, wearing only a thin wool sweater beneath his red and black buffalo plaid flannel, his posture relaxed in a way Jack had not seen on another man in weeks. The stone floor beneath Walter's feet radiated heat upward, steady and patient, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for this moment. Rex stood at Walter's side, tail low but wagging once in greeting, his amber eyes bright, calm, observant. Jack froze, one hand still raised from knocking, his face registering disbelief before he could stop it. "You're not burning?" he asked, voice hoarse. Walter shook his head slightly. "Fire went out hours ago." Jack stepped inside, the door closing behind him, and the silence swallowed the wind whole. The warmth was not the harsh, drying heat of a stove pushed too hard. It was even, layered, wrapping itself around Jack's body until his shoulders dropped without his permission. He took a step, then another, boots pressing against stone that felt warm through the soles. He crouched instinctively, pressing a gloved hand to the floor, then pulled the glove off and tried again, as if his skin needed to confirm what his mind refused to accept. The stone was warm, not near the stove alone, but across the room, a low, constant presence that did not fade with distance. Walter watched him quietly, understanding without needing explanation. On the wall near the center beam hung a simple brass thermometer, its needle resting at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature had dropped well below zero. Jack stared at the number, then laughed once, sharp and humorless. "That's not possible," he said. Walter shrugged. "It's happening anyway." Word traveled fast after that, carried not by rumor, but by measurement. Jack left without ceremony, his face unreadable. But the next morning he returned, this time with Thomas Avery in tow. Thomas was a man in his late 50s with a heavy build softened by age, his thick brown beard flecked with white, and his eyes perpetually narrowed, as if the world were always a little too bright. He had been a carpenter once, respected for his precision, until a fall from a roof years earlier left his knee permanently stiff and his temperament permanently cautious. Thomas did not trust accidents, coincidences, or claims without proof. He brought a thermometer of his own, larger and more precise, and insisted on hanging it near the center of the room. Walter did not object. Rex watched the process with mild interest, then returned to his place near the stove, stretching out as if bored by human uncertainty. They waited in silence. Minutes passed. The needle climbed, then steadied. Thomas checked the stove, found only cold ash. He checked the seams along the walls, running his fingers along the packed insulation, the tight joints. Finally, he straightened slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to something quieter and more dangerous. Respect. By afternoon, Sarah Whitcomb arrived again, her steps careful, her breath shallow from the cold. She looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, the careful braid of her hair coming undone as if even that small order had become too much effort. Inside the cabin, she sank onto a crate without comment, hands spread against the stone as though grounding herself. "I haven't slept through the night in days," she admitted after a moment, her voice stripped of its usual composure. "The ovens help during the day, but at night—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Walter poured her water again, watching as color slowly returned to her face. She studied the room with a baker's attention to detail, noting how the warmth seemed to linger in corners that should have been cold, how the steep walls pressed the heat back inward instead of letting it vanish. "People are scared," she said quietly. "Not of you, of being wrong." As the days passed, the cabin became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People came one or two at a time, rarely together, rarely announcing themselves. They stood, they felt, they counted. No one laughed anymore. Even Earl Jensen fell silent after standing inside for 10 minutes, his mustached face stiff with something close to embarrassment. He left without speaking, but the next week he was seen hauling stone from the creek behind his house. Walter noticed. He said nothing. At night, when the visitors were gone and the wind resumed its assault, Walter sat alone with Rex, the cabin holding its warmth like a secret finally allowed into the open. The memories still came, but they felt less sharp now, dulled by the steady certainty that something he had built, something small, dismissed, almost accidental, was working. Rex slept deeply, his body rising and falling in rhythm with the house itself, as if the stone, the shape, the heat had synchronized them all. Walter rested his hand against the floor and felt the warmth pulse upward, slow and reliable. It reminded him of campfires long extinguished, of nights when survival depended not on force but on understanding. By the end of that week, no one questioned the numbers anymore. 12 hours after the fire died, the cabin still held warmth. Half the wood, sometimes less. No drafts. No desperate feedings in the dark. The truth had stepped through the door with Jack Miller and refused to leave. Winter still howled outside, merciless and vast, but inside the strange triangular house near the lake, something had shifted. Duluth had found a fact it could not argue with, and Walter Collins had become, against his will, the keeper of it. Spring arrived in Duluth the way winter had, reluctantly, without apology, and on its own terms. Snow lingered in shaded corners, stubborn as old beliefs, while thin lines of meltwater traced their way down streets that had known nothing but ice for months. The wind off Lake Superior softened, but did not disappear, carrying with it the damp smell of thawing earth and iron. Walter Collins noticed the change first in the light. It lingered longer in the evenings now, spilling through the narrow opening of his A-frame and warming the stone floor, not from fire, but from the sun itself. Rex spent more time outside, stretched along the edge of the porch, his dark coat gleaming as patches of white fur gave way to early spring mud. He was 7 years old now, solid and calm, his movements economical, as if he understood that survival was no longer the question, adaptation was. The visitors came differently in spring. No longer under cover of darkness or desperation, they arrived in daylight, carrying notebooks instead of thermometers, questions instead of doubt. Tom Hargreaves was among the first, his broad frame looking lighter without the layers of winter clothing, his laugh returning but tempered now with humility. He stood inside the cabin, hands on his hips, studying the angles. 55 degrees, he said, nodding at the roof pitch. That's what you used? Walter nodded. Tom scratched his beard, eyes thoughtful. I always figured steeper was a waste. He paused, then smiled ruefully. Turns out I was wasting wood instead. Sarah Whitcomb came often, sometimes bringing bread still warm from the ovens, sometimes just bringing herself. With spring color returning to her face, she looked younger than she had all winter, though the careful lines around her eyes remained. She was tall and slender, her dark brown hair now worn loose more often, catching the light when she leaned forward to examine the stone base around Walter's stove. Sarah asked careful questions, the kind shaped by a mind that ran a business and balanced risk daily. How thick was the stone? How far did it extend from the stove? Did the stove have to be centered, or could it sit off to one side? Walter answered honestly, never embellishing, never claiming more intention than he'd had. Stone was free, he repeated. Wood wasn't. Sarah nodded, as if that alone explained everything. Others followed. Earl Jensen arrived one afternoon, his thick mustache trimmed shorter than usual, his barrel chest wrapped in a cleaner jacket than Walter had ever seen him wear. He did not apologize. He did not need to. He walked the interior slowly, boots heavy against the stone, eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in calculation. You think limestone would work the same? He asked gruffly. Walter shrugged. Heavy stone holds heat, he said. Type matters less than mass. Earl grunted, satisfied, and left without another word. 2 weeks later, a pile of stone appeared behind Earl's house, stacked with the same care Walter recognized from his own aching hands months earlier. Not everyone came to copy. Some came simply to understand. Thomas Avery returned several times, notebook in hand, his carpenter's eye tracing the joints, the seams, the way insulation was packed tight against the sloping walls. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. It's not magic, Thomas said one afternoon to a small group gathered near the doorway. It's geometry. It's mass. It's not letting heat go where you can't use it. His stiff knee locked briefly as he stood, a reminder of the fall that had taught him caution. We forgot that bigger isn't always better. The first new A-frame went up in late April. It belonged to a trapper named Henry Lawson, a lean man in his early 40s with wind-burned skin and sharp eyes that missed very little. Henry had spent the winter burning through his savings just to stay warm, his traditional cabin eating wood faster than he could cut it. He built his structure smaller than Walter's, with a slightly steeper pitch and a limestone floor he hauled from a nearby quarry. When he lit the stove for the first time, Walter stood quietly beside him. Rex sitting at his feet. Neither man spoke much. They didn't need to. By the next morning, Henry's smile told the rest of the story. Soon after, a young couple from Wisconsin began their own build on the outskirts of town. They were newcomers, still carrying the optimism Duluth had beaten out of most long-term residents. Their A-frame was narrow, just 14 feet wide, insulated with sawdust and clay, the roof layered with sod for extra mass. Sarah stopped by often to bring them food and advice, her voice steady, encouraging. She had seen what happened when people learned too late. The couple learned early instead. Walter never led these efforts. He never stood at the center of a crowd or raised his voice. He answered questions when asked and returned to his own routines when they were done. Each morning, he split a small stack of wood, more out of habit than necessity, the rhythm grounding him. Rex followed, sometimes carrying a short stick in his mouth as if contributing. In the afternoons, Walter sat on the porch, watching the town change in subtle ways. Stone piles appeared where there had been none. Roof lines sharpened. Conversations shifted from ridicule to planning. What surprised Walter most was not the adoption of the design, but the change in how people spoke to him. The cautious distance faded. Men who had once laughed now nodded in greeting. Sarah lingered longer when she visited, sometimes sitting beside him on the porch, as Rex lay between them, her hand absently resting on the dog's warm flank. "You didn't just build a house," she said once quietly. "You gave people permission to rethink things." Walter considered that. He thought of the war, of doctrines followed until they failed, of lives lost because no one questioned what they were told. People were ready, he said finally. They just needed proof. As spring settled in, the last snow receded, revealing the scars winter had left behind: split fences, warped doors, empty woodpiles stacked like warnings. But there was something else now, something sturdier beneath the damage. Knowledge, practical, tested, undeniable. The laughter that had once followed Walter Collins across town had dissolved into something else entirely, something closer to respect, though few would have used the word aloud. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky over Lake Superior in muted gold, Walter sat quietly, Rex at his side, the stone beneath them still warm from the day's light. He thought about how close he had come to failure, how easily things could have gone differently. He did not feel pride so much as alignment, a sense that he had built in accordance with something older and truer than fashion or tradition. Small, steep, heavy, efficient, the kind of principles that did not shout but endured. That winter, Duluth had learned a lesson it would not forget. Not because it was told, but because it was lived. The strange little houses with their sharp roofs and warm floors were no longer jokes. They were referenced quietly, with appreciation, when the wind rose and the cold returned. People called them by a new name now, spoken without irony. Houses that knew how to keep people alive. At the end of that winter, nothing supernatural descended from the sky. No thunder, no visions, no sudden riches. And yet, many in Duluth quietly agreed they had witnessed something close to a miracle. Not a miracle of spectacle, but of alignment. Wood, stone, shape, and patience coming together in a way that sustained life when everything else seemed intent on taking it away. Some said it was clever design. Others called it luck. But a few recognized a deeper pattern one often overlooked. That God does not always save us by removing the storm. Sometimes he teaches us how to build within it. Walter Collins did not pray for warmth, and his house was not built as an act of faith in the traditional sense. But faith often moves without announcing itself. It shows up in the quiet choices to use what you have, to waste nothing, to listen more than you speak, and to trust that creation itself carries wisdom when we stop fighting it. Stone holds heat. Small spaces protect life. Steep roofs shed what would crush us. These are not accidents. They are lessons written into the world long before we were born. And when we learn to live in harmony with them, we find that God's provision has been there all along. In our own lives, winter comes in many forms. Sometimes it is financial struggle. Sometimes it is loneliness, illness, grief, or exhaustion that no one else can see. We burn ourselves out trying to keep the fire roaring, believing that more effort, more noise, more sighs is the answer. But this story reminds us that survival and peace often come from the opposite direction, from simplicity, from humility, from building smaller, stronger, and closer to what truly sustains us. God's miracles are not always loud. Often they are steady. They hold through the night, even after the fire goes out. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of a winter you survived, or a lesson you learned the hard way, share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what season of life you're walking through right now. And if you believe, even a little, that there is meaning hidden in quiet endurance, subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing stories like this. Stories about faith, resilience, and the small wisdoms that keep us alive. May God bless you wherever you are watching from. May He keep you warm in your winters, steady in your storms, and mindful of the quiet miracles already surrounding you.